Many important questions have been asked over the years, like what is the meaning of life? Why can't Metroid crawl? Why are there 10 Luigis stored in this room? And why can't you run in EarthBound? Of all the critiques that are made of EarthBound, this has gotta be, for me, one of the most unfounded. Yet everywhere I look, it's always add a run button, add a run button. Here's a question in return. Why? Why add a run button? Yeah, I said it. Why does EarthBound need a run button? Is this a problem that's even really there? Let's dissect. I get it. Mother 1 and 3 both have them, but the design of said games are different from EarthBound's to the point where they warrant one. Mother 1 has a huge world, much bigger than EarthBound's, and Mother 3 intentionally has you going through places you've already been through to connect you with its world, so you're traveling much more in that game than Mother 2, as well as it being an all-around easier game than EarthBound. And if you think movement speed is slow in EarthBound, be so thankful we didn't get stuck with the speed shown in the beta. In EarthBound, the towns and cities for the most part really aren't that big, and oftentimes you're put on a pretty linear path. This sake of comparison amongst the games leads to a critique that is overall pretty groundless, or at least not fully thought through. There's really only like 2 points in the game I can even think a running function would even be somewhat helpful. One is in Dungeon Man, since you do have to travel through the first part of the dungeon twice, with nothing really being changed the second time until after you've already completed the section you've been forced to repeat, and this section really should have been shortened the second time around. The second place is in Deep Darkness, with how slow the swamp makes you. But to be fair, the slowness here is sort of the point, and flatly removing the inconvenience really defeats the purpose of a swamp even being there. But overall, both of these sections account for, 15 minutes of a 25 plus hour game? The areas in EarthBound are also purposefully made, oftentimes narrow, to keep the player from just running away and evading everything, and instead despawning them, like a real gamer. This is also why the skip sandwiches really aren't as helpful as you might expect, as the layouts of the maps are intentionally drawn in ways to make sure you're running into enemies. The big culprit I always see pointed to for this criticism is Dusty Dunes Desert, and frankly, I think these complaints are wrong. Let's really observe what you do in Dusty Dunes throughout the entirety of the game. The first visit, you have to go around the traffic jam, sending you out there with the option of exploring its further reaches, and you can even just follow the road by hugging the southern cliff. It even puts you right in the path of Montague, so it's also pretty unlikely you'll miss talking to him before heading to Fourside. When you return to the desert in search of Montague, he's right near the entrance to the area, which is, 20 seconds to walk to? Then when you have to come back for the monkey caves, yes, you have to walk a long distance to get to them at the west side of the desert. Here's the thing. 1, this again accounts for a minute max? Maybe another if you have to go back to the vendor later for the picnic lunch and skip sandwich? 2, this is intentional, and meant to contrast with how fast travel becomes once you get teleport, which is right at the end of the very caves you're heading to. It's meant to make you thankful for getting it. This game design 101. You don't give the player something insanely helpful at the very end, or they'll feel robbed of its usefulness, and you don't give it to them at the very beginning, or the struggle without it would be non-existent. And once you have teleport, travel is no longer an issue. And really soon after that, you get teleport beta, which makes it even less of a problem. The game often doesn't make you go out of your way to places that take a long time to get through, just to make you walk all the way back. They make the enemies run away afterward. They make important locations stick out so you're not lost where to go. They give you exit mice. I think the real reason so many wish there was a run button is so they could avoid enemies easier. Okay, now I know this is going to be a point that I'm going to get crap for, but honestly, my answer to the run button question here is still no. You have to understand something. Depending on the RPG you were playing, making enemies tough to avoid or even completely unavoidable around this time is just par for the course. They were designed this way, 1, so the player would be around the proper level for what's ahead of them, and 2, pad the game. Is this good game design? Yes and no, I suppose. It's not a fun solution, but it's what was commonly done. The answer really is to redesign a lot of the game, frankly. You'd have to rebalance it, then come to terms with that it'd also be much shorter, which for the development team really wasn't an option with how long the game was in development for. 5 years of work into an RPG couldn't translate into only a 10-hour game. Nowadays, RPG players get a lot more choice in terms of how much fighting they do, and this is also due to EarthBound's strategic elements of battle frankly lacking, which is honestly the bigger issue here. Games are much longer now, but lastability even then was an issue, so tedious fights were just considered what you do when making an RPG. But to make running work within how EarthBound's designed, you'd also have to increase the overworld speed of enemies. Yes, even faster than they already are, keeping the quantity of battles about the same, which would really end up hardly changing anything in the long run. The other factor that lends to the shift in battle quantity nowadays are also the much more common difficulty settings many RPGs offer. Difficulty settings in RPGs were pretty unheard of at the time Mother 2 was released. It really wasn't even an option to include. The desire for this supposed quality of life adjustment honestly doesn't appear to really even improve it in a major way. Now, I'm not saying adding running would make the game worse or anything, and I have no problems with fan games and patches adding it, and some are even doing what I mentioned and trying to retain the design elements I just mentioned. It could even make it a little better, though I question how much it would improve it. But I think it's disingenuous to suggest the actual game not having it inherently makes it worse. The size of the maps and enemy layouts were designed around this choice, just as the other games were designed around including running. And I think the reason why many call for one, candidly, is because these players already know what to do in the game and are trying to get through it faster. And basing this criticism in what I suspect is impatience is a bit rash and really isn't taking into account everything around it. Remember the first time you played EarthBound? You probably spent tons of time wandering around each area and talking to all the NPCs, which is also why so many are scattered around the larger areas, to incentivize exploring them to discover more fun dialogue. And finding these moments and wonderfully weird characters in between the larger story beats enriches the world with personality and flavor. It's what makes the game so memorable. Why would this world be worth saving if we didn't care about any of the things in it? I'm just saying, perhaps people like to look for problems, even when they might not really be that damning. Humans are two things: problem solvers and problem makers. We like to look for things to bother us, for things we think could be fixed. We don't like things to be perfect, and when we find those non-problems to problemify, boy do we dig into them. We like to make ourselves miserable for some reason. And in regards to art, I think this leads us to making impulsive critiques that are oftentimes at least somewhat unsubstantiated. And I think the problem we see in the speed in which we move in EarthBound comes from a good place, even if it's somewhat misguided. We've played it so much that we know it like the back of our hands, and just want to experience it faster, to get to our favorite moments as soon as possible. But cliche as it may sound, maybe it really is the journey and not the destination. Maybe those moments in between are what make them so special. The breathers in between let them stand out. And as we've all seen, there's no drought of interesting things to experience. Call me a sap, but I do think there's beauty to appreciate in the mundane, the little moments. Not everything needs to be a rush and flurry to get to the next thing. Life is nothing if not just getting around one roadblock just to get to the next roadblock. So maybe the real answer here is instead to adjust our view, instead of thinking everything around the circumstance needs to change. Maybe they're not roadblocks. Maybe it is only for now. Just a small, not as great moment in a sea of incredible things we get to experience. So hopefully this shines some light on why this is the way it is, and is honestly a big part of what makes the game feel the way it does. A lot of people don't want to accept that some of the things they're not happy with run deeper than any sort of simple fix. Sometimes to fix something at large, you do need to go back to the basics, the foundation, or come to terms with what you may be seeing as a big problem maybe isn't so bad. Maybe it's only temporary. Instead of only thinking of the enjoyable moments past the slower times, let's enjoy those too. They do make up drastically more of our lives. Otherwise, we're just destined to not enjoy anything. What I'm saying is to just remember, things aren't so bad. Things will never be perfect. But it sure makes those imperfections just a little bit easier to deal with.